And thanks again, everyone, for joining us here today on our next in the series of data-driven agriculture webinars, where we discuss all the things related, data-related in agriculture. And we're in this new era where the data we collect and the way that we look at that and the way that we use that to make decisions is going to be very important. And I think you're going to enjoy. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment here, but a couple of things. Next slide, please, Randy. Just point out these websites that you can go to. The recordings of past webinars are posted on the Digital Ag website there. There's also a very good UAV site to take a look at. And then we appreciate, again, the support of the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network that several of us here are affiliated with, and a lot of our projects are funded by this. Okay, and so after this week, just one more in our spring series here, and I'm assuming that we'll be redoing this in the fall or in upcoming webinars too. So, and a little bit of housekeeping before we start, before I introduce our speaker, is that if you have questions on the go, use the chat room and the chat feature and put your question in there. Leave your cameras off and your microphones muted to keep our sound quality and our visual quality the best. And at the end, as we always do, if we have people that want to ask a question verbally, we'll open it up and we'll have a kind of a round robin session at the end. So today, we are really fortunate to have a colleague of mine and a person that I enjoy spending time with, and it's Dr. Nicole Widmar, an ag econ here at Purdue. And I've already reviewed her slides, and just before the presentation here too, I looked through her CV, and my goodness, what a productive person you are, Dr. Widmar. What did I count? 18 publications in 2020, and goodness knows how many in 2021 so far here. And you have degrees from Cornell and Michigan State. You have animal science interests, I know. And you're currently the associate head in Ag Econ as well, and the graduate program chair, which I know is no small task. And so, Dr. Widmar, welcome again, and please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Is sound quality okay? I'll keep going. Yep. All right, so thank you very much for having me today. I'm excited to contribute to this series. We're going to jump in and talk a little bit about publicly available data, not in the traditional way. We're going to look at online media data. So we're going to look at public data for the public good, and we're going to, I want to call it astonishing, but I think it's probably just petrifying uses of online media data, and think about that specific to ag and food markets, or at least from the perspective of an agricultural economist. So if we start kind of ag econ traditionally, what do we do? So thinking about markets, right? We talk a lot about demand factors, who wants what, how much of it do we want, what are we going to pay for it? We think a lot about agricultural commodity uses and things like that. On the supply side, we talk about cost of production, efficiencies or lack thereof. We think about when things are made, how things are made. And we all know that biological systems are inherently risky, right, in this regard, in terms of we don't really know how much the crop's going to make. We can project and somewhat guess, but those systems are inherently risky, and that adds an element of risk into this market conversation. We also spend time thinking about consumer perception. Consumer perception certainly plays into demand, right? So how does the market at large decide what's going to be really hot this season, what everyone's going to be looking for? But we also think about public sentiment, right? So distinction here between consumers being those who actually consume the item we're talking about versus the public, where everybody gets a say whether you participate in that market or not. And then industry meets regulation meets reality. Hashtag 2020, I think, fits in here, where we can start to think about how markets are supposed to work versus when we're under stress or duress or experience shocks. So this is really where we spend our time. But we're going to transition here quickly into the kind of meat and potatoes of what we're here to talk about today. And so social listening is monitoring, segmenting, and analyzing online media. And it gets the most attention in social media. So think about things like Twitter, and we know the situation with Facebook data, but it's actually much broader than that. So you can think about online media data, everything from if you've posted a review on Yelp, if you've posted a review on a product on Amazon, if you've posted pictures anywhere, all of these things that you share generate data. And we inherently know that, but very few of us internalize what that actually means. And so a lot of us are carrying around how many people, if you don't have a smartphone, can you let us know if you are not a smartphone owner?
Yeah, there's nothing showing up in the chat here.
Okay, so as you sit there clutching your iPhone, wearing your iWatch, right, and potentially, likely sitting in a room with a smart device of some kind, right? So nowadays, even your refrigerator talks to the internet, right? So if you have a smart appliance, all of these things are generating massive amounts of data. We don't really put a lot of thought into what that data is actually used for. We like it when it's useful. So when the iPhone says to you, you're 17 minutes from home, when you never told the iPhone you were going home, right? So iPhone knows where you're going and then tells you how long you're going to get there, and you feel somewhat comforted. But that amount of data is used in a lot of different ways, a lot of ways you see and a lot of ways that you don't. So it's a bit non-traditional in the ag and food space, but got started on this back on a sabbatical in 2016, came across some of the data and analytics that was going on at Disney World of all places. And so I shared a picture there, taking grad students with me, but not taking Dr. Lusk, the department head, to Disney World to go look into some of this data analytics from other industries. And so this is kind of where it all started. But the bottom line is you're putting data on the internet all the time. Most of us are. You're sharing data with app developers and all of these other aspects. We're going to hone in on social listening, which is monitoring and analyzing what is accessible in social and online media in today's presentation. So this gets referenced as Web 2.0. So Web 2.0 gives a lot of opportunities. Web 2.0 is really referencing the fact that it's not an individual media generator and a media consumer anymore. It's the fact that each of us is generating or has the potential to generate media, and then each of us has the potential to be a consumer of that media. So it's no longer the case that something gets produced as an article and then other people read it. No, a lot of us are generating media and a lot of other people are reading it, and it's much more of a true net, and it's a worldwide net. So the internet has evolved even as in the short time that we've actually lived in this era of the internet. Online and social media analytics are generally developed in the private sector. So there's a lot of profit motive to understand what you want, when you want it, where you want it. So for example, you'll see things like if you've ever tweeted at an airline from inside an airport, right? They know where you were when that tweet happened. How do they know? Well, it has a geofence around the airport. And so companies are actually monitoring what are consumers saying when they're interacting in a specific location, or when these comments are originating from a certain geographic area, or if you're mentioning certain words. There's been a lot of published research linking stock prices to sentiment shifts in online media. So we've been able to build online media searches, track that media over a time period, 2, 3, 4 years, and then actually look at how stock prices moved with movement and sentiment. So we know it works for individual companies. The real question here is, I think this is underutilized in food and agriculture sectors. It's not as obvious what the profit motivation would be to study, for example, milk as an industry, as opposed to looking at the movement in sentiment about a specific firm. I also think it's somewhat underutilized in the public sector, and I'm clear that that's just my opinion. So there's lots of ways that online media, we can say surveillance, it's not really what it is, but listening is used in public sector, but I'm not seeing it used in food and ag sector, understanding supply chain in quite the way that we're interested in. So if we're going to start out, I think big data, which gets thrown around a lot, I really don't know what it is. I do believe that it's big, right? So there's your kind of obvious contribution for the day. There's a lot of it, so quantity does matter, but I'm more interested in the fact that it's mixed format and it's in great variety. So I think it's scope of data that's the true challenge here, more so than simple scale. We also need to think about text as data, so it's qualitative. I'm making it quantitative in most of my analytics, but text is indeed data, as are images and videos. The catch for a lot of research projects, and also for how private industry is using these, is that processing an image or a video is not trivial. So the programming that goes into, for example, there's a kind of famous examples of recognizing a zebra. Well, since the zebra's stripes don't match any other zebra, it's very hard to teach a computer, this is a zebra, this is what they look like. Whereas a human can recognize images like that. And so you get into these cases where we know that that's data and we know that it's useful for certain sets of decision making, but how to process that in real time and use it effectively is a kind of bigger question, in particular when you're thinking World Wide Web and what the scale is that needs to be processed in time. There's a lot of limitations that go into social media data. So I used to say it could be messy, but it just is. So social media listening is messy. The data is not clean. There's a lot of slang, misappropriation of tone. It's hard to teach an algorithm to understand humor. For example, humor is actually a very complex human thing. And so that makes it quite difficult. Some terms are harder than others. So we learned in a multi-year project that eggs are particularly bad. So Easter eggs are hidden in video games. So there's a lot of references to eggs. It's not as simple as just searching eggs that are out there. We did a little bit of work on coffee. And so if you're interested in coffee and pricing coffee and what people care about, you have a problem with coffee tables, right? So as people start to reference other things, and as it comes to ag, animals, so pigs in particular, but any animal that has a cartoon alter ego is particularly hard. So if you think you're just going to go out and search for information about pigs, then most of it's going to be about Peppa, right? And that's really not what we intended from a food and ag standpoint. So I bring this up only to raise the idea this is not a 30-minute exercise. We start to understand why it doesn't get done in public sector or for industry-wide, because it is a complex thing to be able to search out data that's actually usable. So it's not that it's being ignored, it's just that there are challenges with how you actually integrate this and do it for the public good side. I acknowledge, so not everyone's on social media, not everyone's online, although this is true with basically any data source. So not everyone's going to take your survey, not everyone's going to buy your product, not everyone goes to the same store, location, et cetera, particularly in this ongoing pandemic era, and not everyone even cares about your cause. So indeed, there are limitations. Not everyone will be represented in the data that we're about to talk about. However, this is a limitation with any data set. And so I don't see this as replacing anything historically in market research, but I do see it as augmenting or adding to what's already out there. So we have a series of ongoing research projects here in Ag Econ. I think the part that's really interesting for me in this space is that individual companies, they own the data that they generate, right? So I can go and ask Kroger, for example, can I have your data on what meat sells on what day? They don't have to give it to me. They have all that data. They use that data to make decisions. Here in what we're talking about today, it's the internet and it's public domain. You didn't think about that when you put it on Twitter, right? Because you were tweeting to your followers, you were sharing something, but it's out there and it's searchable. And so it's really a big data playground if you're able to go out there and gather it in a usable way. And so we're thinking about that from a human behavior, both consumer and producer standpoint. My motivation behind all of this is kind of fundamentally that we think we know what the public thinks about food production and ag systems. But I'm increasingly concerned, what if what we think is not what actually is? And so it's not specific actually to this online media data conversation. This is also what fuels a lot of my interest in surveys or looking at different buying behaviors. But it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And so I do tend to come back, okay, so if we're advising livestock industries or we're advising producers to make certain investments or do certain things, we better be sure that that's actually what the public is interested in and that we're not missing each other in conversation, because it's the producers who are going to make the investments. And so these comments shouldn't be made lightly. And that's really the motivation here is, can we dig deeper? Can we see what people are really talking about? And are we sure that's what the public sentiment was saying, or that's where the public is asking for changes in a production system before we go making investments? So how are we using social media data here in my group? So we started out looking at Valentine's and Galentine's Day as a proof of concept. I know it sounds a little bit wacky, but we started out working on holidays. They're commonly talked about. They don't really share terms. So we don't have like a Peppa Pig situation. And so we started out looking at holidays. We kept tracking holidays during the pandemic because there's a lot of discussion about changes in holidays, particularly thinking about meal choices and the size of meals that were served last year. So we've continued to track that, but that's really where we started. From there, we've walked through a bunch of different commodities. We've thought about different industries. We've thought about the USDA. And my plan here is to fly over 5 distinct examples. I'm going to give you a couple take homes from these examples, and then I'd be happy to talk about them or give more detail if people are interested. But we'll start at just kind of a flyover of things we've been able to find or discover. So example number 1, we spent a lot of time, as I said earlier, talking about eggs. And so it finally came out in 2020 in Poultry Science, where we were able to publish our look into what we called #eggs. And so I keep referencing them as they're incredible, they're edible, but they're also extremely well socialized. People talk a lot about their breakfast on the web, it turns out. And so we dove into, what do people talk about eggs over time? And so I'm showing you on here the number of posts that occur. You can see very clearly, so we have daily data, so we can see movement by the day. You can also see pretty clearly here these spikes that happen right before and around Easter each year. And so there's a lot of discussion around eggs, and there's about 300 or 400 search terms that are in the algorithm here. So we're searching for inclusion terms, but we're also then spending a lot of time programming in all of the terms that we actually don't want. We don't want an egg if it's referencing something in a video game, for example. And so what I'm showing you is as close as we're going to get to clean online media data, not claiming that it's perfect, but that there's a fair amount of due diligence and it's reproducible. We're publishing all of those search terms, which is something else that differs between public sector and private sector. Very seldom will you get to reproduce what private sector is doing as far as online listening. And so we're attempting to take that into a kind of public space, peer-reviewed publication space, so we can learn more about how this data is or isn't useful. So this is baseline, when do people talk about eggs? What's the number of posts? What's out there?
Let me interrupt here, Dr.
Yeah.
Widmar. Just have a thought. How do you get this data? Can I access this? Do I have to pay big money for it? How do you get it?
Yeah, so there are a variety of platforms that will help you do it. So, I mean, you can write code, and you can write Python or various other languages to kind of climb through, and you're just going to be looking for words. It's getting harder depending on the platform you want to search. So like Twitter is reasonably simple, but you do need a token, right? You can't just climb around on Twitter without at least having an active Twitter account. Facebook is going to make you buy it. So most of our data, we're only able to access public-facing Facebook pages. We're not able to climb through those very well. Everything I'm going to show you here, we're using NetBase. NetBase is one of the better known platforms in terms of an online media search. And so it's facilitated by their platform. They facilitate access and making sure you're in compliance, thinking about things like privacy through all of these different platforms. And so we're able to comb national media. It's pretty much most things that aren't locked down or behind a paywall. So we're able to comb through news media, online media, reviews, if you've posted them, comments in response to news, all of Twitter, most of Instagram, blogs, as long as they're not locked. And so it's a pretty diverse amount of media. In each of these publications from these examples, it does give you the breakdown for where it's coming from. And I think I did show on here for eggs, most of the data for eggs came from Twitter, but we also have Reddit, Backyard Chickens, Instagram, TripAdvisor, fitness, bodybuilding, Cafe Mom, lower carb. So you can see where the top mentions of each topic are coming from, and it's in each of the papers.
And I'm amazed how much is available publicly. I didn't realize that. So very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Yeah, your tweets are out there, Bruce. So giving you just a little bit of detail. So we're going to kind of look into the different types of things we know. So we know that you talk more about eggs on Sundays, which probably makes sense when you have more time to tweet about your breakfast. We do then know, we don't know date and time for every single source, right? So we pretty much only know date and time if you've allowed that in your posting on Twitter. And we just talked about, we're able to break down where the search hits are coming from for each individual topic. And it differs quite a bit. Twitter's very big. Twitter's the social media platform we're most able to collect from, but it does switch depending on the specific topic that we're talking about, where media is most commonly found. What we learned on eggs, so we've spent a lot of time thinking about hen housing in particular, and that's really where this paper was rooted is, we talk about cage-free eggs or how chickens are being raised. And so those were the conversations we were starting out with when we think about it from a research standpoint. Once you dive into the data in terms of online media, it's really about eating eggs. There's not a lot of discussion about producing eggs. It's about, 100 different ways to cook an egg and what you're going to eat it with. And so it does help a bit, right? We tend to get into silos and we're all talking about what size a cage needs to be or what's a battery cage going to be in the future. And that makes sense in ag circles. We're talking about what that needs to be. It is helpful once in a while to kind of look out and look at the landscape of what's the general populace talking about eggs. Well, it's mostly about consuming. Over time, you see movement. So the green is positive comments, and that's using natural language processing through NetBase to assign positive versus negative tone. And so what you see is that net sentiment is generally positive. Net sentiment is a number that ranges from negative 100 to positive 100. So positive 49 is quite positive. You'll also see that you can check in real time as things are moving. So here, there was the beginning of a discussion about a salmonella scare. And so you can see that the negative comments kind of start to grow. And so we're looking not only at the total volume of comments, but we're also looking at change over time or change by day, massive growth in the amount of attention or massive change in the sentiment. There were mentions of, so eggs in general is over here, and I have my sentiment mapped out. There were mentions of free range, which also had high sentiment. Enriched colony, almost none compared to the total comments, but generally positive. Some comments about battery cages that tended to be negative, and then cage free, which was very positive. But what you'll notice is the scale. So the number of actual comments that involve these words is relatively small compared to eggs in general, which we already said was generally dedicated to eating experience. We're also able to comb through all of those comments, posts, articles that occur and get caught up in our search filters. So this is looking at the hashtags that were included in posts that mentioned things like free range. So if you mentioned free range, the hashtags that were most common in there, you were talking about organic or food or free range. So free range, this is this is boring in terms of we learn that you say free range. That makes sense. There are others potentially that would turn us on to other deeper dive perhaps. And so cage free, for example, hashtag glyphosate was in the top mentions. Now, granted, it's a relatively small number of mentions. Hen hell is obviously not a positive term, generally referencing what the alternative was as we looked through those posts. So I share these not to say in and of themselves are these hashtags useful. I don't know, but I do think they're useful from a researcher standpoint for what are you talking about in reference to cage free? How did glyphosate end up being in the same comments and posts as posts about cage free eggs, for example? So I think there's some things we can learn and it can inform further research in that way. Example 2, so we did some work on food markets and recalls. AgEcon spends a ton of time thinking about the impact of recalls on consumer demand. Historically, we find very small, if any, impact of recalls on demand. And we've for years wondered why. Why aren't they larger? What's going on? So we pulled the data from FDA and FSIS for the real situation, so the real number of recalls. We also pulled data from CDC on initial illness reporting. And I'll fly over and we can always come back to each of these examples to give you some insights here. So we took search terms, we looked for the most common causes of foodborne illness. And then we had some exclusionary terms. I'm giving you just a few examples here. So we were not looking for vomiting due to morning sickness, for example. We were looking for vomiting in response to foodborne illness. And so this gives you a little bit of detail in terms of the actual terms that are programmed in here for the search. This is your number of mentions in the blue bar. So this is my social media findings, right? How often did those search terms get caught up on a month-by-month basis? I've also overlaid the number of FDA recalls, the number of FSIS recalls, and the number of CDC initial reports. And we're going to walk through this. My question underlying here was, does social media help? Does online media mean anything as it references these foodborne illness situations, right? Is it an early warning system, for example? So as you see people commenting, is that useful information or which follows the other? There's lots of ways to go with this. What we did is we looked at it on a month-by-month basis. So the way to interpret this is if the bar is red, then social media and number of recalls did not move together that month. If the bar is green, they did move together that month. And if the bar was gray, we couldn't discern with the movement. And so what we have here is FSIS recalls. And what we know is that it's super jumbled. There's no statistical relationship here. So we looked at this and said, well, maybe this makes sense. So we know from AgEcon literature, the number of recalls is not typically terribly impactful for demand for food. So maybe we don't care. There's lots of reasons why it doesn't show up more strongly. You see roughly the same thing on FDA. So yeah, some months they moved together, but other months they really didn't. And so this is not statistically significant either. Now, when you go to CDC initial illness reports, what you see is something quite different. So here we do have a statistical relationship. And so what we learned from this is that the online media mentions are moving with the CDC initial reports of illness much more so than they move with the recalls that get issued. And this makes sense because this is actually getting sick. So when the CDC tells you, people got ill off of X item, people share that and talk about it and respond to that. When something gets recalled, we're not seeing nearly that same response. And so from a public standpoint, we started to wonder, maybe there's space here. Maybe we should be paying much more attention to initial illness reports instead of focusing always on the actual recall that tends to take more time and has more governance behind it. Third example recently came out in Pathogens and Global Health, and this was teaming up with Dr. Audrey Ruppel over in Public Health, thinking about public perceptions of mosquitoes. And so we didn't know how timely public perception of a health threat would be when we started doing this work back in 2017. But in 2020, obviously, there's a lot of ways to think about public comments and how that affects public health standpoint. So if you remember back to 2016 is when we first started talking about Zika virus. And so we can think these are likely areas, right, where these mosquitoes were living and reproducing. And so if we start with that, we wondered, is in an unstructured setting, when we look online, do people talk about mosquitoes, right? So remember, if you remember back, there was all these push to help people make better decisions about mosquito protection and being careful. And we were worried about Zika virus spreading more broadly in the US as it had already done in the Caribbean. And so we looked for comments about mosquitoes, and it's broken down, so videos, images, and then text and number of posts. And what we found is actually people do talk about mosquitoes online, and they tend to talk more about mosquitoes during mosquito season for most of North America, which makes sense. We talk about it more in the summer. When we looked over this time period from 2016, 17, 18, we started tracking data. What was by far the most common, so yes, we talk about mosquito bites, but what we were really seeing were comments about the Zika virus. So you see comments like Zika and virus, worried particularly about pregnant women, which was a big conversation at the time that we started collecting data, and actually became a bigger conversation during the data collection period as we knew what the impacts were reasonably severe in various areas. What we learned, however, is if you look at mosquitoes, you can see here's my summer season, here's my summer season as we look over time. And this is the initial conversations about Zika that drove massive attention. So mosquitoes, we talk about every summer and kind of expected volume in terms of number of posts. If I look within the mosquito search for Zika, it was huge. It was a big share of the conversation back here when we first started talking about it. And what happened over time is what happens with a lot of public health threats is over time, it just became a shrinking share. Could you argue that this tiny little bump over here is a bump that coincided with the spike for mosquitoes? Sure. But I mean, you have to squint to see it. The real answer is that over time, conversation about what still remains a public health threat shrinks. And so as a share of conversation about mosquitoes, Zika shrinks over time. Could you use this data for public health education, those sorts of campaigns, if you could actually project and know when people lose interest, for example, when they're no longer talking about something that's still important? So example 4, closer to kind of ag sector, thinking about fairs. So this was a collaboration with a PhD student at the time from animal science, and then a PhD student who was working with me, Courtney Burr, here in Ag Econ. And we wondered, going to the fair, agricultural fairs, this is a big conversation. This is still one of the last frontiers in terms of where the public directly interacts with livestock animals. And in this setting, we wondered, what do people say about the animals versus the experience of the fair? So this might be how we think about the fair, but what do they really talk about when people go to the fair in the general public and what's actually out there on the web? And so what we did was we collected data about fairs generally, and then we broke it out into what do people say about livestock, and then what do people say about fair food. We cared a lot about fair food, tends to be related to a lot of livestock and agricultural groups, also tends to be a topic that we like to talk about in social media. So we broke it down this way, looking at livestock versus fair food versus everything else. And here's what we learned. We were studying July 1 of 2017 through middle of September 2019. So we were trying to get multiple fair seasons in there. And what we learned for starters is that people actually do talk about the fair. Some states had more than others, and we don't have to get into a big conversation about which states are more popular. But there were clearly states that focused more on the state fair, that had more of a fair culture to them. There's a significant number of mentions, certainly enough to be able to talk about. And overall, the net sentiment surrounding fairs is positive. So we had 56%. And remember again, negative 100 to positive 100. So positive 56 is quite high for net sentiment. We also learned that people talk about fair food and livestock at roughly the same number of mentions. So there's a lot of fair conversation that doesn't fit into our categories of interest, but they do talk about livestock and they do talk about food. Now, what's important to notice first is, well, we love food. So fair food has a 96% positive net sentiment. Livestock has an 88% positive net sentiment, which both of those are significantly higher than all fair conversations on the whole. The other thing I'll point out to you is if you look across the sub searches about the different livestock, mentioning of beef and dairy or cattle, mentioning of poultry, swine, these are all extremely high. So we've done projects related to Disney World, for example, and you don't always get net sentiments about the Magic Kingdom that are as high as the net sentiments we found about beef and dairy cattle when people were referencing them at the fair. So as much as we discuss the interest of the public in livestock, and we tend to focus on the parts where the public is very critical of livestock industries or ag industries, this is overwhelmingly positive. And this is on the web, where I don't think I have to tell you, people are not always polite, and they're certainly not always overwhelmingly positive. So this is very, very high net sentiment as it relates to comments about livestock and in reference to agricultural fairs. And the last flyover example, so I did a little study into USDA back when USDA was moving out of DC, because why not? We'll do a controversial look at what people were saying on the web about this decision. So people do talk about the USDA. We love to argue about USDA reports. And so my base search, right? So we're talking over 2.7 million mentions that we're working with here, lots and lots of potential impressions. Comments about the USDA get shared a lot. The mean net sentiment about USDA overall was 24, so overall positive. But when you apply a filter for relocation, relocate, and move, it drops to -7. And so the chatter about the relocation of USDA was clearly more negative than the average chatter about USDA, which is really saying something, because we do love to fight about what a USDA report says, why they're not correct, etc. So this is a pretty significant number, or at least I interpret it as a pretty significant number, even though the number of mentions about the relocation and move was a reasonably small share about total mentions of USDA. This is looking at net sentiment over time. And so when we started really having conversations about the relocation of USDA, you can see that the net sentiment for USDA overall is actually pretty steady over time. It moves with the release of different reports. So if you look at an hourly net sentiment, for example, it moves around. But if you look at it on a monthly or weekly basis, it's pretty steady until we debate the relocation. And then you're in this era over here, where it moves around quite a bit and it generally moves down. You can also think about the words relocate, move, relocation, and what you'll see is that you could pretty much draw a line down here moving downward, as opposed to commentary about other aspects of movement that happened before then. And then even their comments about reports. So looking at the reports that USDA releases, if you look at the comments over time, those bounce around a lot. So we love to fight about, for example, the WASDE, or we argue about different reports that come out, particularly during planting season, or if we look in September, October timeframe. But even those experienced a little bit of a downturn in net sentiment during the time period we were talking about relocation. Sometimes it was in reference to, is this going to disrupt reports? We know it disrupted human talent in terms of whether people were able or willing to relocate. So I thought it was an interesting topic. If you're going to talk about public data, when we think about ag in the United States, public data and USDA, that's huge, right? USDA data that's publicly available that kind of levels a playing field so that producers, consumers, everyone has access. This is kind of it's a pillar of how US ag has developed. And so I thought it made sense to look into what's the public sentiment of our entity that generates this public data, and how is it affected by an event, a reasonably rare event that happened during this time frame. So I wrap up over all 5 topics that we flew over way too fast, but I think there's increasing evidence that the market, right, thinking from an economic sense, does move with online sentiment. I don't know the directionality. So it does appear that online sentiment and what we're able to collect in very careful online listening is related to what happens in the real world. Now, which ones happens first, which one's the chicken versus the egg, we could debate for different topics. But I think on the positive side, it does help. So we've thought about things. There's a lot of online media use to identify crisis. So thinking about things like natural disasters, tracking comments from people asking for help. We can measure what's said naturally without directly prompting people. It's a data point that supplements but doesn't replace other data sources. And we can also think about marketing and brand management and research to improve overall understanding. Now, on the negative side, you basically have to accept that at this point, if you're on the web, somebody's watching everything that you're doing, right? So every time you purchase something, at least the person you purchased it from knows what you bought, when you bought it, how you bought it, and they know what else you were looking at. This is why Amazon can tell you what you need, even though you don't know that you need it, right? To what end is your data being used? Is there a profit motive behind it? Of course, there's a profit motive behind it. Any one of us doesn't do very much without some kind of motivation or some kind of incentive. What does private really mean? You never read those acknowledge, the following terms and conditions to download this app. It's in there, right? So interestingly, people really like to kind of hate on Facebook, but the answer is you signed up for Facebook and you said yes, you checked the box. Facebook didn't do anything that they didn't tell you they were going to do. So how is my data being used? We need to kind of add on to that. Have you considered how your data is being used? And then do you really care? Because most of us want the iPhone to tell us nice things and know what we want. And we want Amazon to show us exactly what we want. So most of us share willingly. And so there's a question, what's private? What did you agree to share? There is certainly in kind of underbelly of social media data. So if you think about purposeful manipulation of people, so political cause, control mechanisms, certainly, if you know enough about a person, we learned this during all the scandals with how Facebook data or how Facebook advertising and data was used. I'm not saying it can't be misused. Of course it can be misused, but I am saying, are we going to let the question about misuse stand in the way of potential public good? And certainly the loudest voices are still heard, and they may not truly represent the public perception. So social listening data to amass data, or to amass data that's actually usable, it's not simple, it's not cheap, and it takes time. There's a ton of investment by individual companies. There's a huge learning curve, at least in my research group, thinking about how to scrape data for commodities or general ag products. But I still fundamentally believe there's room to make a contribution in the public good space, right? So thinking about things like food safety, animal ag and derived products, all of our questions about what the public wants when it comes to meat and meat products, for example, and then thinking about commodities and industry level insights. So I do think there's space to make a contribution there. None of you will now because you're all scared, but you could follow me on Twitter and we could talk about it. More than happy to take questions. Hopefully that fits in the time frame you were looking for, Bruce.
Absolutely perfect. The only problem, Nicole, is you got me hungry for fair food now with all your discussion. No, a really interesting topic. And let's open it up. And Randy, I'm assuming that people can speak if they unmute now. Let's open it up to anyone that has a question or comment. And if you don't, I have a couple up my sleeve, and Dennis has a couple up his sleeve too, I'm sure. So anyone, please go ahead. Okay, well, let me just start then with everyone's probably saw this in the chat, and I had a similar thing too, but one thing that we had heard in the past was for pest management, integrated pest management. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on this, Dr. Widmar, in that, Dennis was saying, like, if there's been a say a dicamba application and where that front is possibly going to go perhaps. And I was thinking of like, spider mites or leaf blights or something like that. What's going on in those areas and what work is being done? And I don't, that we expect you to know all this stuff, and maybe you don't work with this intimately.
So are you in reference to online data?
Right. Let's just say that like a bunch of farmers are texting other farmers or putting on Facebook that, oh my gosh, the corn leaf blight is terrible here in Kentucky. And maybe that'd be good for the southern Indiana farmers to know this.
So interesting. We've done a little bit. We're still working on programming. So slang and comments and abbreviations make some of these a bit difficult in terms of how people reference. But certainly there's some space to be tracking what people are talking about different areas geographically. All of it kind of falls into this space, both your question and Dennis's comment. We argue so much about who owns data, right? Like who's sharing this different data. People spend so much time fighting about who owns it and very little time thinking about how to actually use it. Right. So, and then there you are just tweeting it out for the whole world, putting it on the web anyway. And so I think this space is ripe for some kind of question of how much is being shared versus not shared. Are we sharing it online in a way where I could find it or scrape it or others like me? It's probably less talked about than some other topics that are a bit hotter, right? In terms of the number of people chatting about them. But I think we've been able to find comments of this vein, right? We've been able to track them. So we looked last year at comments about yield. Certain things are better to search than others, though. Very few people tweet out, look how terrible my yield is. Whereas people tend to really like to tweet pictures of the exact correct angle of the field with how high the yield is. Now, how usable is that? I don't know, we could debate. But certainly people do talk and share different kind of comments, questions, concerns. And so I think there's space, who uses it and for what purpose could still be debated, right? I mean, I could use that to try to sell you a product. Am I helping you? Maybe. Am I helping me? Probably. Otherwise, why would I use it that way? Or you could envision it in a more kind of public good sense, right? From a research standpoint of, is there a way to assist, provide information, at least have people know that other people are having the same concerns in real time? There's different ways to go with this.
Go ahead, Dennis.
I do have a question, Nicole, since you're talking about gleaning the tweets and the posts, etc. Would it be possible, maybe someone has done it, maybe you've done it, you sort of troll the public posts and you might have a better indication of percent of corn planted, etc. Could we replace some of the USDA surveys with data that you're just gleaning that they're offering up anyway? I'm curious whether it might be more accurate. Maybe it's flawed because it grabs a certain different demographic than the total, but maybe it's representative. I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that in general, ag and food, we can augment survey data with online media data. I don't know that we can replace on the ag producer side. So we do have still a pretty significant digital divide in rural areas, right? So we're not nearly as active on the ag producer side in terms of public post, public share, or even real-time upload of our data as some other industries are. So I'm not ready to say you would replace. Plus, we tend to share only the good, right? So I think people are going to tend to be biased towards, nobody says like, I just didn't go to the field today because I didn't want to. People tend to put out what's more positive. So I'm not ready to say it's a replacement, but I do think you could detect, for example, and we've been able to do it with limited success, where people started planning, where some of the earliest stuff went in, when people went out to the field. People love to post pictures of like, we're headed out to the field. Machinery photos are big. We all love pictures of machinery. So we can see things like that. Do I think it replaces? Not at this time. Could it in the future, or could it potentially for some other industries that have more connectedness from the point of production? Maybe.
So one thing I'm picking up on
It's
too,
also got
Doctor.
me thinking,
Go ahead, Dennis.
oh, it's just got me also thinking about, I'm an ag machinery guy. I think about probability of a working day, influence on what size of machinery you ought to have, which now very quickly becomes an economic issue of investment, capitalizing the farm. Maybe there is a way to tease out of those posts plus weather, like what is a better model of working days than historic data, which is kind of flawed.
At least for point of comparison. Yeah, I think that the stage that we're in now for most of our research projects is we're reasonably comfortable now, although it took us 6 years, to be reasonably comfortable that we can go out and surveil a topic and be pretty clean in terms of the data that's in that data set. And then the question is, how does that relate to either known experience or other data that's kind of been more traditional? So we've done things like, for example, stock price versus our numbers, or number of illnesses versus our numbers. And so I could certainly see a place where you could talk about working days or planting versus what we're able to surveil. So you could at least, you don't know that either one is correct, but you could at least start to say, do they say roughly the same thing at roughly the same time? And if they do, then you may have a second surveillance mechanism. If they don't, then you really do need to think, maybe one of them's just too thin, or maybe there's just not enough. I worry about the negative comments. We're much more free with negative comments as a consumer. So we tend to complain more on that side, whereas when we're the producer of a specific item, we don't tend to say as much negative about what's going on. But I also think that's changing as people live more and more online. And the pandemic has done some interesting things as more of us are more and more comfortable with basically everything's online. So there's less filter in terms of what people share. So that may change it over time too.
So Nicole, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking someone that does this type of work not only needs to know their domain, like whether it's crops or livestock or food or whatever, but it would seem to be that you would need a fair amount of understanding of human behavior, psychology and marketing choices and all that type of stuff. But my question is, what types of careers are available in this area? Does AGCO have a person that's following what people think of their new Fendt combine? Does PepsiCo have people that are tracking this to see what people think of, Doritos or their brands? What are the possibilities here for careers?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways this goes, and I'm not sure I can be comprehensive, right? So we do know, so Dr. Courtney Burr, she's out at Oklahoma State now. Courtney was working with me for her PhD when I got us into this in the first place and decided this was something we could do. And she rightfully said, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot that goes into this. And I will admit it took until about 2020 to get some clean data there. Now, there's lots of people who work, so we know that the big, right, so Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, Delta, United, all of these companies have teams dedicated to online and social listening. The skill sets vary from, whether it's communications, whether you're the one doing the actual programming, or whether you're contracting that out with somebody like NetBase or one of these other listening companies where the programming, you might have an arrangement that way. That I think is pretty established in private industry. I think it's done much more so in food and other kind of tech related, hotel and hospitality does it a ton. That's a kind of point of contact thing. I hear it talked about less in ag. I don't know how many companies are really investing in doing that. We've done it from the outside for several firms, right? So we released something a few weeks ago about Syngenta and looking at some different comments, Syngenta, Land O'Lakes, and Bayer. We also look back at Monsanto and mergers and how all of those things resonated in the public. Are they doing it also? I don't know the answer, but I do think that there's room for people with subject matter knowledge to come in and ask the question. Maybe you're not the one actually collecting the data, but are you the one asking what that data means to this ag food production or ag input firm, right? I think there's a lot of space in there from the agronomy side or animal science side or ag econ. There's also just a ton of computer science that goes into the background of that, but I'm not sure that's the exact space we're talking about.
I can imagine that some of your students that you're working with now and getting masters and PhDs, I mean, this would be a possible career for them to go do something like this. And I just have to comment also on Dennis Buckmaster's comment about, we were talking about fair food, and could fair food ever be good or excellent, Nicole? I mean, it could only be fair. So
well,
I don't tell it as good as Dennis.
This is the best part though, because you have to teach the algorithm about the word fair, meaning different than fair.
Oh, like fair skies or yeah.
Yes, and so you actually, what you do is you train it so that you teach it if it says fair and then this and then fair and then that and then fair and then this. And most natural language processors have some scale built in. So like love is really good and like is like kind of good. But fair was actually really hard. We had to actually go in and put in hundreds of examples where the word fair did not actually mean fair. So yeah, Dr. Buckmaster raises a problematic point.
Hey, and not only humorous, but useful too. So anyway, unless someone has a last question, we're getting close to the time, and this has been a really interesting discussion. I knew it would be, Dr. Widmar, but this has been especially good. And Randy, if you want to put up, there's the last couple of slides. We'll see you again here in another week. And not you, Dr. Widmar. If you want to come back, that's fine. We'll have you back anytime. But we're going to have Dr. Evans next week. And so thank you again. And so next week is Dr. Evans, and he's going to be talking about machines and robotics. And again, on behalf of Purdue University and our digital ag work here, we thank you for your participation today, and signing off now.